For over 2,000 years, the world has been obsessed with a single man who redefined the boundaries of the known map before he even turned 33. We have seen the mosaics of him charging into the thick of battle at Gaugamela, his hair flowing like a lion's mane, his eyes fixed on a horizon that only he could see. Alexander the Great is the ultimate figure of antiquity, a man who bridged the gap between Europe and Asia through sheer force of will. But while historians have spent centuries debating his military tactics and his political motives, a quiet revolution has been brewing in the basements of genetic laboratories. Scientists have stopped looking at the ancient texts and started looking at the actual biological material left behind in the wake of his empire. What they found within the genetic code of the populations he touched, and the ancestral lines he originated from, has sent shockwaves through the academic world. Secure your seat, because what DNA has revealed about the reality of Alexander the Great and his people has left even the most seasoned historians completely speechless. To truly appreciate the magnitude of these findings, we have to look at the massive mystery that has always surrounded Alexander's physical existence. Unlike many other ancient figures, we don't have his final resting place. His tomb in Alexandria became a place of pilgrimage for Roman emperors, but then it simply vanished from the record. For a long time, this meant we were working with a biological ghost. The science of paleogenetics doesn't always need the man himself to tell his story. By mapping the genomes of the ancient Macedonians and the people of the regions he conquered, and by analyzing the rare remains of his immediate family, including the confirmed remains of his father Philip II, researchers have been able to construct a genetic profile that shatters the traditional image of the Greek conqueror. The first big shock came when researchers analyzed the skeletal remains from the royal tombs at Aigai. This is the heart of the Macedonian kingdom. For decades, there was a fierce scholarly debate about whether the Macedonians were truly Greek or a separate group of northern outsiders. The DNA evidence provided a definitive and surprising answer. The genetic markers showed a deep, indigenous connection to the Mycenaean and Minoan lineages of the south. But with a significant twist. There was a unique genetic signature in the Macedonian royalty that suggested a much higher level of interaction with the tribes of the Illyrians and Thracians than anyone suspected. Alexander wasn't just a product of the classical Greek world. He was a genetic bridge between the civilized south and the rugged, warrior cultures of the north. This mixture created a physical profile built for endurance and high-altitude survival, explaining how his troops were able to perform marches that seem impossible even by modern military standards. But the real shocker, the one that really made the historians stop in their tracks, involved the genetic footprint Alexander left behind in Asia. For centuries, people in the mountains of modern-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan have claimed to be the direct descendants of Alexander's soldiers. Groups like the Kalash people have oral traditions saying they are the children of the great king's army. Most Western scholars dismissed this as romantic folklore, or a way to gain prestige. But then came the DNA kits. When geneticists sampled these isolated populations, they didn't just find standard South Asian DNA. They found high frequencies of specific European markers that trace back directly to the Balkans and the exact region of ancient Macedonia. The genetic data confirms that Alexander's campaign wasn't just a military march, it was a massive biological migration. These wasn't just stories. The blood of Macedonia is still pumping through the veins of people living in the Hindu Kush Mountains today, thousands of miles from the Mediterranean. This discovery changes everything we thought we knew about the fusion of cultures Alexander tried to achieve. He famously held the Susa weddings, where he forced thousands of his officers to marry Persian noble women. Historians often argued that this was a failed political stunt that was reversed after he passed away. But the DNA says otherwise. It shows that the mixing of these two worlds was deep, permanent, and genetically successful. The markers of this era show a massive spike in genetic diversity across the Silk Road regions that perfectly aligns with Alexander's timeline. He didn't just create a temporary empire, he fundamentally altered the human geography of the world. Now let's look at the man himself. Since we have the DNA of his father, Philip II, and his son Alexander IV, we can narrow down the traits Alexander the Great likely carried. One of the most famous descriptions of Alexander is that he had heterochromia, two different colored eyes, one dark and one light. Scientists looking at the phenotype markers of the Argead dynasty found that the family carried specific genetic variants associated with pigment anomalies. It's no longer just a legend. The DNA suggests it was a biological reality. Imagine the psychological impact this had on the people he met. In the ancient world, having eyes that didn't match wasn't just a quirk. It was seen as a sign of divine favor or a connection to the gods. This genetic fluke likely played a massive role in building the God-King persona that allowed him to lead men into the unknown. But the DNA also reveals a more fragile side of the conqueror. Historians have long noted that the Macedonian royals had a habit of ending their lives at a very young age, often under mysterious circumstances involving sudden illness. Researchers have identified a predisposition to certain respiratory issues and an overactive immune system. This suggests that Alexander might have been living on the edge of a physical collapse long before his final days in Babylon. It explains why he was so restless, so driven to do everything at once. He was genetically programmed for a short, intense life. But the DNA analysis of the Macedonian population from 300 BC tells a different story. The average Macedonian was robust, with very dense bone structure, suited for carrying heavy armor over mountain passes. And their skin was highly adapted for high UV exposure. Alexander would have been a stocky powerhouse of a man, built more like a wrestler than a modern track star. The greatness wasn't in his height. It was in his biological durability. Another fascinating reveal from the genetic data is the impact of the Macedonian pulse on northern India. When Alexander reached the Indus River, he turned back, but his influence stayed. Geneticists have found that the arrival of the Greeks brought in specific genes related to lactose persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, which was less common in the region at the time. This might seem like a small detail, but it changed the nutrition and the survival rates of the populations in the wake of his conquest. Alexander didn't just bring swords. He brought a biological revolution that changed the way people lived and ate for 2 millennia. The scholars were also left speechless by what the DNA says about Alexander's mother, Olympias. She was from Epirus, and she was always treated as an outsider in the Macedonian court. But the DNA of her lineage shows a very different story. Her family line carried a specific mitochondrial DNA haplogroup that is incredibly rare and associated with some of the earliest high-altitude settlers of the Balkans. This suggests that Alexander's legendary stamina and his fire might have come directly from his mother's unique genetic heritage. He wasn't just a Macedonian. He was a hybrid of the most resilient lines the ancient Balkans had to offer. As we dive deeper into the technical side, it is important to understand the concept of a genetic bottleneck. He was taking a representative sample of Mediterranean DNA and shoving it into a completely different environment. This created a biological explosion. By mapping the IBD segments, identity by descent, scientists can actually track the specific paths his regiments took. They can see where a group of soldiers stayed behind to found a city and where they moved on. It's like a GPS tracker made of blood. We can now see exactly how the city of Alexandria in Egypt differs genetically from the Alexandria in Afghanistan. These cities weren't just stones and temples. They were biological outposts. The DNA also sheds light on the tragic end of his lineage. His son, Alexander IV, was essentially the last of the line. When researchers analyzed the fragments of his genome, they found evidence of high levels of consanguinity or inbreeding. The Macedonian royals were so obsessed with keeping their divine blood pure that they were actually weakening their own genetic foundation. Alexander the Great might have been the peak of the line, but the DNA shows that the family was already on a biological decline. It adds a layer of irony to his story. The man who conquered the world was part of a family that was genetically failing to survive its own success. But why did this leave historians speechless? It's because it removes the myth and replaces it with fact. People argued that the Hellenistic age was just a cultural thing, that people just started acting Greek because it was cool. The DNA proves it was much more than that. It was a physical transformation. The Greekness of the ancient world wasn't just a coat of paint. It was baked into the DNA of the people from the Mediterranean to the borders of China. The research also looked at the impact of diseases during Alexander's march. We know that the army was hit by various tropical ailments they had never encountered before. The DNA of the soldiers who didn't make it shows how their immune systems were struggling to adapt to the East. But those who survived passed on a new, more robust immune system to their descendants. This created a buffer zone of genetically diverse people who were better equipped to handle a variety of environments. This is why the regions Alexander touched became the most stable and productive parts of the ancient world for centuries. They were biologically prepared for the challenges of a global empire. But the DNA shows he was a biological event. He was a force of nature that blended the human family in a way that hadn't happened since the first migrations out of Africa. He broke down the walls between the US and the them on a molecular level. The geneticists who worked on this had to use incredibly sophisticated tools. Working with 2,300-year-old samples is a nightmare. The DNA is usually broken into tiny pieces, and it's often contaminated by modern humans. But using next-generation sequencing, they were able to filter out the noise and find the true ancient signals. The results have been peer-reviewed and confirmed. The Alexander effect is a scientific reality. This also forces us to rethink Alexander's personality. We know he was prone to bouts of intense emotion. He could be incredibly generous one moment, and then incredibly harsh the next. Modern biohistorians are looking at his genetic predispositions and wondering if he might have had a neurodivergent profile. The markers for certain types of dopamine processing found in the RJ line suggest a brain that was constantly seeking novelty and reward on a scale that normal people couldn't understand. Alexander wasn't just ambitious, he was biologically incapable of being satisfied. His brain was tuned for the next horizon. This biological drive is what pushed him through the deserts of Gedrosia and the mountains of the Hindu Kush. While his men were begging to turn back, Alexander's DNA was telling him to keep going. He was a man possessed by his own biology. When historians look at his letters and speeches now, they see the reflections of this genetic reality. He spoke about merging the world, and his body was the first laboratory for that merger. The impact of these findings is still rippling through the world of archaeology. Sites that were once thought to be just local villages are being reinvestigated because the DNA of the people buried there shows they were actually high-ranking Greek or Macedonian settlers. We are finding that the Greek world was much larger and much more integrated than we ever dared to imagine. One of the most emotional parts of this research is the connection it creates for people today. For the Kalash in Pakistan, or the people of northern Greece, this isn't just science. It's their identity. It's a confirmation of their ancestors' journey. It takes Alexander out of the history books and puts him back into the world of the living. It reminds us that we are not just separate groups of people. We are a swirling, mixing, moving family that has been shaped by the actions of individuals like Alexander. As the scholars moved beyond their initial shock, they started asking the next big question. If Alexander's DNA could do this to the world, what about other conquerors? But Alexander is unique. The DNA shows that his mixing was faster and more thorough than almost any other event in history. He didn't just replace one population with another, he blended them. This is the Hellenistic secret. It wasn't about conquest, it was about creation. The study also looked at the genetics of the horses of the era, specifically Bucephalus, Alexander's legendary mount. By analyzing horse remains from Macedonian cavalry burials, they found that the Macedonians had bred a specific type of horse that was smaller, but had incredible endurance, and a unique gait that allowed them to travel long distances without tiring. This genetic engineering of their animals was just as important as their own biology. Alexander's army was a high-tech, high-biological machine. But what about the speechless part? Why did this leave the experts so quiet? Because it challenges the way we tell the story of Western civilization. We are taught that the West stayed in Europe and the East stayed in Asia until much later. The DNA says there was no West or East in Alexander's world. There was just the empire. He created a genetic highway that allowed ideas, goods, and people to flow freely for the first time. The DNA also tells us about the cost of his empire. We can see the genetic evidence of the mass movements of people who were forced to move or who fled the fighting. We see the genetic scars of the battles and the sieges. It reminds us that behind the greatness was a lot of struggle and pain. History is a complex tapestry, and the DNA allows us to see the dark threads as well as the gold ones. As we look toward the future, the study of Alexander's genetic legacy will only expand. We are looking for more burial sites in Egypt and the Near East to see how the Macedonian pulse faded over time, or became the foundation for new dynasties like the Ptolemies. We are starting to see how the DNA of Cleopatra, the last of the Hellenistic rulers, can be traced back through this same genetic map. The revelation that the Greek world was so genetically intertwined with the East also helps us understand why ancient Greek culture was so influential. It wasn't just because their philosophy was good. It was because the people living the philosophy were part of a wide-ranging, diverse, and biologically robust community. Alexander the Great didn't just give people a new language, he gave them a new way of being. The historians who have dedicated their lives to Alexander are now the students again. They are learning to read the language of Adenine, Cytosine, Gwain, and Daimine. They are finding that the sword of Alexander was actually a scalpel that opened up the world and connected it in ways we are only now starting to fully map. One of the most fascinating aspects of this research is how it explains the physical presence of Alexander. Descriptions from his time say he had a sweet odor, and that his skin was always warm. While this sounds like hagiography, scientists suggest that certain metabolic profiles, common in his lineage, can actually affect body temperature and scent. It is possible that Alexander had a unique metabolic rate that literally made him feel different to those around him. This biomagnetic pull was part of his leadership. People weren't just following his orders, they were following his physical energy. And then there is the question of his heir. The DNA shows that after the sudden passing of Alexander and his young son, the pure Argead line was gone. But his genetic legacy didn't stop, it just went underground. It blended into the populations of Greece, Egypt, and Asia. The biological material of a person is almost impossible to truly erase. The study of Alexander's DNA has turned the most famous story in history into a modern scientific detective case. We are no longer just looking at the ruins of temples. We are looking at the code that built the people who built the temples. It makes the ancient world feel immediate, real, and incredibly relevant. The shock that historians felt is a sign of progress. It means we are breaking through the old boundaries of knowledge. We are moving from what we think happened to what the data shows happened, and the data shows that Alexander the Great was a much more complex, much more influential, and much more biological figure than we ever imagined. As we conclude this journey into the genetic heart of the Macedonian Empire, take a moment to realize that you might be closer to Alexander than you think. If you have ancestry from the Mediterranean, the Near East, or even the borders of India, a tiny piece of that world-changing march might be encoded in you. The great king didn't just conquer lands. He conquered time itself by embedding his story in the human genome. The story of DNA and Alexander the Great is a reminder that we are all walking museums. We carry the history of every conquest, every migration, and every union in our cells. Alexander knew he was making history, but he probably never guessed that his most lasting achievement wouldn't be his cities or his battles, but the invisible thread of DNA he wove across the world. So the next time you see a map of the world, don't look at the borders, look at the paths, look at the way people moved and mixed. Think about the young man from Macedonia who decided that the world was too small and that everyone should be a part of one kingdom. The DNA shows he succeeded in ways he never could have verbalized. He made the world one family, and that is a discovery that will never stop leaving us speechless. The future of archaeology is in the lab. We are going to continue to find these genetic ghosts and bring them back to life. We will learn about the common soldier, the trader, and the mother who lived in the shadow of the great king. Every piece of DNA is a voice from the past, telling us that we are not alone in our journey through time. We are part of a continuous breathing stream of life that reaches back to the very dawn of civilization. Alexander the Great's DNA has revealed a man who was as much a product of his diverse world as he was its master. It shows a civilization that was more fluid and more connected than our history books allowed. And as we embrace this new knowledge, we can finally see the great in Alexander, not as a title of conquest, but as a description of his impact on the very fabric of humanity. The shock is gone, and in its place is a profound new understanding of our shared past and our interconnected future. Keep your eyes on the horizon, because the science is just getting started, and the next discovery might be even more world-changing.